you who are here can attest I'm either liked or loved or hated, depending on the fact that I work in HR, which generally makes me pretty evil, and then depending on what you think of Zynga, you might also have that impression. I've been with Zynga for 3.5 years. We were just over 100 people when I started. I joined because I really believed in the mission that Mark Pincus sort of aspired around connecting the world through games. And I felt really, really passionate about the idea that games were really leaving out a certain audience, and I myself felt like I was one of those people left out and was excited to help build a company. We had no idea at the beginning that this was really going to be the phenomenon that it is. And so what I'm going to talk about today is really some of the things that we did to help build Zynga, and some really what I think are practical sort of hands-on tips and tricks if you are building your own workforce or you're thinking about how to retain that workforce. So just to give you a little sense of Zynga's growth, we're about 5 years old, and I literally tracked for you the sort of growth of the company. So in January of 2008, we had 11 employees. I think you actually heard from one of our earliest employees this morning on a panel. And then at the beginning of the year, we were just about 2,800. We're a little over 3,200 employees worldwide now. We are about 40% engineering oriented, so we have one of the largest engineering workforces actually in the technology industry, because we do very little sales and marketing that really sort of requires us to have this massive workforce on the engineering side, which has made us one of the fastest growing technology companies in the history of the Valley. And that's obviously given us a lot of challenges, and one of the things that we decided early on was that we weren't going to sacrifice talent based on geography. And I definitely will say that there are some pros and cons to deciding to do this. We have over 20 locations worldwide now. Some of those are as small as 9 or 10 people, and then obviously some of them, San Francisco, for example, we have into the thousands of employees working at our location there. And as we've done this a lot through mergers and acquisitions. I think a lot of people assume that the bulk of our workforce came through that. It's actually only been about 17% of our workforce came through mergers and acquisitions. The rest has all been organically, so that means that people that we've either passively looked out and said, hey, we've tapped you on the shoulder and said, hey, come, are you interested in Zynga? Or people who've applied to us and that we've sort of hired through our own sources and workforce. It does, if you are building a company, place a lot of stress on sort of your infrastructure team. So the positive of having all of these smaller teams has allowed us to work in the studio system, which has allowed us to scale a lot easier. Many of the companies, especially in the technology space that you hear of, one of the things that really stresses them as they get 4, 5, 6, 7 years out is that you have employees who tend to get bored, or they don't necessarily feel like they have a lot of things that they can do or that they can go and work on, especially technology companies that are like a single product company. They only work on one thing and it doesn't really scale that well. One of the advantages, obviously, of our space is that we have been able to scale with game teams and allowing them to operate in a studio model. And as some of you have probably heard before, and I'll refer to in a little bit later, we allow people to sort of CEO that experience. But that's also helped us be able to find really great pockets of talent and not being afraid to pull them into the Zynga family regardless of where they are in the world. One of the things that we started with, and when Mark and I were first meeting and we were talking about sort of how he thought about the company and what he wanted to do, was I was looking for a place that really had a commitment to talent. And Mark had that same vision. We actually spent about 3.5 hours together the first time that we were meeting. And the whole discussion was around talent. How do you attract great talent? How do you keep great talent? How do you motivate people? And obviously, I'm the people person, so that was interesting to me and exciting to me. And that was something that I was looking to hear. And we had gotten a lot of great advice from John Doerr, who was an early investor at Kleiner Perkins. And John had said, you know, in his experience, people should spend at least 20% of their time on talent. So that means that 1 day a week, if you assume a 5-day work week, should be spent thinking about your people, talking about your people, growing your people. If you have managers, you should be investing in those managers. That's a really hard thing to do. If you're small, the idea of spending all of that time on people seems a little overwhelming because you're trying to get your business up, you're trying to get revenue. A lot of great advice from, it seems like people should just know how to do this, it should be a no-brainer. But the most important thing that I hear all of these companies say is talent is the most important, or I have to go after the best people, or I want to build the best management team. And yet then all of those companies don't want to spend any time actually building those teams or developing those teams or thinking about those teams. And that's a really, really tough balance to make. And one of the things that I've really pushed our executive team, even as we've grown, is how do we keep up this idea of this 20% of your time is spent on your talent? How do you think about the idea of hiring and attracting is probably one of the most important things you do at the beginning of a company, but then retaining and developing is one of the things that you should be spending the time on later on. So I would, if you were running a company, and those of you who are in the room probably are involved with that, how much time do you spend? Look at your calendar. How much time is actually spent on your people, developing them, having one-on-ones? All of these things that you say are sort of, oh, these are manager check-the-box things that actually should be the most important lifeblood of how you're operating your company. Let's see. Okay. So the next thing that we did at Zynga is we when I first got there, we didn't really have a set of, hey, what does a great hire look like? What is important to us? How do we want to operate as a company? They're all things that just were sort of coming up. Like people would say like, oh, what's important to us is that we get the game out on time and that we keep everything up and that we get new features out and that we're fast and that we are on multiple platforms, and we'd hear all of these things. But we didn't really think about like what at the end of the day was making Zynga special. And so I know that it doesn't seem like it's important at the beginning, and it probably for some of you who have worked at big, large companies where they're just sort of a poster on the wall and you never hear about them again. We felt pretty inspired by the idea that our employees came up with these values, and it was important to them. There were a couple that were important to sort of Mark and he had brought in, and that sort of some of our earlier employees had brought. And generally, your earliest employees are going to set the culture and the tenor and for the rest of the company's history. I think any company you go and talk to, you're going to hear that over and over. It started out with this group, and that's the group that sort of set how things are done. And making cultural change later is exceptionally hard. And some of these are actually really hard to live. They seem super intuitive. I think everybody I know that's worked at a larger company or works at a company likes to say like, hey, I pay for performance. So how many of you guys work at a company that says you pay for performance? If you're a rock star, you get paid more, or you will do that. No one? Really? Or you're just not listening? That's okay. All right, so a good portion of you have said that that's true. How do you live that every day? How do you make that actionable? How do you make it so that you know who's actually delivering and who's great? And we call that being a meritocracy, and that's been really important to us. And it sounds great. On the front end, everybody goes through school thinking that through life it's going to be, if I work hard enough, I'll get the A, I'll be successful, I'll go to the next step. This is how it works. And then you sort of get into the work world and you're sitting around and not everybody knows what you're doing. You don't know what the person next to you is doing. I think when you're a really small company, that's one of the advantages that you have, the sort of morning scrum. You can sort of point to every single person. I know what all of them do. And then you start to scale a little bit bigger, and then all of a sudden, you don't necessarily know what the person next to you is doing. You don't know what the person down the hall is doing, and there are all these questions as to, well, I worked harder, or that person delivered more, or I got bigger results, and how do you do that? And it doesn't seem like it's a big deal, right? Oh, I'm sure it'll all work out. I'm sure it'll be fine. And what happens is that a lot of companies, that just sort of drills down and gets watered down into, well, that person's been here a long time, so I feel like I should have to promote them. They've been here 2 years, they've never been promoted, or as we'd like to say, they never leveled up, so maybe we have to do that. Or, oh, that person, they know so-and-so, and they work really well together, and if I don't give them something, they might decide to leave. And the hard part around that is that's not a meritocracy. And one of the things that we've really strived for at Zynga is that we've been able to live that value. And on the great side is that when it works, it's everybody's happy, right? Oh, I know that person was awesome. I saw what they did. They got rewarded. That's the right behavior. That's great. On the flip side, sometimes what happens is that, hey, my buddy who I really like, but I have no idea what they actually do, but they're a really cool guy, didn't get anything, so Zynga must have been bad to them, or their manager must have missed them. You end up in sort of those conversations. And so what we decided to do is we actually built a quarterly process, so we do sort of a quarterly check-in. The only thing I actually require is that managers have a conversation. We tie in financial rewards with that quarterly. One of the things that I hate are performance reviews. I think they're actually very negative. I think that they're demotivating. And what I find is that managers don't ever want to have the real conversation because they're scared to have the conversation. And the interesting piece is, so I'm on HR, so I sort of catch all of this stuff on the way out, potentially. So one of the things I like to say is I don't like to clean up mess. It really annoys me, so I try to do a lot of stuff on the front end to prevent it. And one of the things I would, sometimes I hear from people is, well, I didn't realize I was doing a bad job. If I had known I wasn't doing a great job, or if I had only known what I should have done to be promoted, I would have done those things. And I have all these managers who say, oh, I'm a great manager, or my people love me. And then we give them the data that their people necessarily don't love me. And they're like, oh, well, that's just because I'm asking them to do work. And I'm like, well, most people come to work to want to do work. So I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And really, at the end of the day, it's hard to be honest. It's hard to be transparent. And it's hard to say, yes, I'm going to give rewards to this set of people. And no, I'm not going to give rewards to that set of people. But if you set that up as a value on the front end, you have to decide to live that. And that's been hard on Zynga, too. I think that we definitely, as we've built the company, I think people have seen a lot of press. I think that there are some employees who maybe didn't get the right message while they were there or felt like they had worked really hard and weren't getting rewarded. And we're unhappy about that. And as my job is to sort of look through that and look through the lens of that and say, hey, but we've been living our values and we're able to say, like, these are the results that are important and we're going to reward those people who get it. The other thing that's been sort of most important to me over time is that people feel like they can build a career. And that's a tough one to do when you're a startup and you're just starting out. When you're just building your company, how do you tell somebody what a career looks like? I always find that to be super interesting because people will come up and say, like, well, what's the next job? Or what do I do next? Or, they want you to actually hand them a piece of paper and say, like, okay, now here's your career path. You go from job A to job B to job C, job D, job E, and then you're done. And that's really tough to have a conversation to say, like, well, actually, you have a lot of options, and you can decide to do this over here, or maybe you decide to do this new studio, or maybe you're going to be a developer on this, or maybe you want to be an executive producer. And the challenge for that is you want to be able to provide people optionality. And what I found, as you probably find in designing a lot of games, is too many options overwhelms people. And they really do need a roadmap. And they do need to know sort of a little bit more clarity. You want to give them some options and give them some choices. But if you give them too many choices, you've actually made it too difficult for them. So one of the things we had to do really quickly as we were scaling is build some job architectures for people to give them a little bit of a roadmap, but then to say to people that this isn't the only roadmap. And I think for people, especially in sort of the North American education system where you used to go, I go from undergraduate education, if I want to go further out of college, I go to get my master's, and then I go get my PhD, and this is how it does, or I go to college, and then I get a job. And we're finding more and more that people are having a hard time getting off of that path. And I think the same thing if you're building your workforce or if you're building your company, one of the challenges that you're going to have are, hey, there aren't a lot of people who've done social games before. We're starting to see more and more people come up through that, but we've got a lot of companies popping up. There are a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience, and what do I do? And so the biggest thing is you need to be looking for the people who have the transferable skills, who are flexible, and can really fit into your environment and your culture. So whatever values you set up or whatever you say, hey, these are the things that are important to me, what are the people that sort of work in that culture and are going to be successful? The other piece that's been important is that people feel like they're CEO, and that means sort of owning an outcome. And the idea of that is that if you say that you've signed up to do something, that you are responsible for delivering it. And that's really hard to do as you get bigger because everybody wants a piece of it. When the product is small, people love small companies because they get a sense of ownership. I got to do this, and you can call your friends and say, like, hey, I did this, and check it out. And I think one of the things that's been exciting about social games is because of the rapid iteration, you're constantly able to sort of point to people and say, like, hey, I did that, or hey, look at that, or look at the results. This has been really cool, versus especially in traditional gaming where people spend 3 or 5 years working on something, you never really knew what you worked on. Potentially your friends never saw it. It's very hard to point to. So that's been a really awesome opportunity. One of the things that you have to think about, though, as your company is scaling is how do you keep that same experience of, I work on this, I'm in charge of this, I'm an expert in this. And so I like to say that the best employees are sort of the T employees, right? So they are sort of broad in a lot of different areas, and you can plug and play and put them into a lot of different situations, but then they're deep in 1 or 2 specialties. So they've got a lot of experience in 1 or 2 areas, and they're really going to be the expert, and they're going to be pointed to. We have a lot of new college graduates that we hire into Zynga, and we spend a lot of time talking to them that there's a lot of ways that you can get your skill set up and running. There's a lot of ways that you can be successful. But what you want to do is sort of get a little piece of everything across the top of the T and become an expert and known at this 1 or 2 things. And it's that 1 or 2 things that's likely going to help you. You're going to have teams that are going to be pulling on you, hey, come work for me, or come work over here, or come work with me. You're going to have a lot of companies that are going to say, like, oh, that's a great skill set. I want a little bit of this, and I want a little of that. But as they try to go down that path of job A to job B to job C to job D, they're going to want all of those skills at the top of the T. And the most important value for me has been this idea of Zynga First. And I think that this has really helped us over time. And I think in particular, as we've sort of gone through a lot of ups and downs as a company, it's been a rallying point. And the idea around Zynga First is I had worked at a lot of larger companies, and as those companies had grown, I kind of felt like people were into fiefdoms. This is my product, or this is what I'm in charge of, or this is my division, and I have all of these people, and that's what's most important. And at the end of the day, like really what should be most important to your company is the value of the whole. And it's sort of all of the pieces together. And if you can always put the idea of, hey, I'm going to reward, and I'm going to recognize, and I'm going to ask people, how is that Zynga First? How are you going to step up and help the company? We have a really sort of good moment around this at Zynga in our history, and it actually relates to Farmville. And when Farmville was first taking off, all of us have heard of that now. We all are sort of familiar with it. We know people who've played it. But when it was first coming out, it was one of those games that just sort of took off like this. And Farmville was this very small team. It didn't have a lot of resources. It wasn't making a lot of money. Poker and Mafia Wars for Zynga at the time were really the big games. And we saw it sort of taking off. And I remember being in a meeting and our CTO sort of saying, like, hey, are we in this together or are we not? Is this the Poker and Mafia Wars company, or are we Zynga? And what are you going to do to help this? This is our rocket ship. We need to get all hands on deck. And because we had this value and we'd already been having the conversations, everyone was like, oh yeah, of course, and started giving up some of their best people to go over to that. And that was a big turning point in Zynga's history, the fact that we were able to capitalize on that. And I'm pretty certain that if we didn't have this value around the idea of this putting the company first, that it was really all about what was going to be in the best interest for the company, and that was going to be in the best interest for everybody over time, that wouldn't have helped us grow at that point. And that would have really hurt us in sort of the growth and development. It's really what sort of helped Zynga launch and take off. And the other point around sort of the Zynga First concept has been, as we have been growing and we've had these sort of acquisitions in these new areas, is we've needed people to sometimes take on assignments that they hadn't really thought of before, or we needed them to sort of maybe go to a remote studio and help us out for a little bit, go teach them all of Zynga's best practices. And asking someone to pick up their life and move for 3 or 6 months sometimes is not an easy task. And you need to make sure that they're inspired. And you certainly can go around the route of bribing your employees. You can say, hey, I'll pay you this if you'll go and do this, or I'll give you more if you do this. But the way that you're really going to get the most value out of your employee workforce, in my opinion, is this intrinsic belief that you're doing something great and that you're connected to something great. And so, Mark and I spend a lot of time with a lot of our leaders talking about, are people inspired by the mission? Do they believe in their connecting the world through games? Do they believe in the company? And if they do, then I think that you're going to actually see people sort of raise their hand more often and be willing to do things that are in the best interest. And if they don't, then it's going to be a lot harder. And I always like to say that money is the easiest lever that you have as a manager. It is the easiest thing that you can go to. It's also the easiest thing that every other one of your competitors can go to. And if that's all you have to offer an employee, then the person who's got the bigger checkbook next door is going to be the next place that person is working. So the other thing that we talk a lot about as a company, are you a missionary company or a mercenary company? And I think depending on what point in time you've been at Zynga, we've probably been on either side of that. And the hard part about missionary versus mercenary is you can't usually stand in the middle. It is hard to ever be in the middle. And when we have people in the workforce who would disagree about what's important, and I think, over time, we've really tried to move much more to this missionary sort of place of like, we want to be this internet treasure. We want to be something that's valued. We want to be something that players are going to be having a relationship with over the long term. But mercenary companies do exceptionally well. You can't really blame them for being mercenary. If you look at sort of what Wall Street wants, if you look at what sort of investors want, if you look at sort of what your employees want, the mercenary side, there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a hard decision to make, and it's one of those things that we're constantly struggling with. And if I were in your situation and I was growing a company and starting, I think that this might be one of the places that you would start from. And there are a lot of different characteristics that make both sides great. You have to decide which one is for you. So one of the things that we did as sort of an employee-centric company is when the day that we IPO'd, we actually decided to bring it to Zynga. So instead of shipping off our management team and sending them to New York City, we actually decided to bring sort of the NASDAQ and all of that experience to our employees to allow them to be a part of that. On the one hand, it made people have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. On the other, it was the biggest example we had as a company of putting Zynga first and being sort of all together as a moment. So one of the things people always ask me is like, hey, how do you make it work? How do you work in HR and sort of the people touchy-feely side of things? How do you pull everybody together? And the biggest thing that I tell people when they're building their company to look for are looking for people who say yes. And I think that that is a big believer. And one of the things I always think about great game designers, and when I'm interviewing game designers, and I am not one, but I like to play our games, so I like to sometimes think of myself as a pseudo game designer, is that they say yes. Game designers are open to every avenue and every opportunity, and they always are open to a different pathway. And I think if you are building a workforce, you're likely going to want to look for people who say yes, and who can say, yes, let's figure out how we can make that work, instead of saying, no, I can't make that work, or no, that can't be done, or no, this isn't the way it goes. So here are a couple of tips I have. I made a little list, and you can take it or leave it. So one of the things that is most important to me is that we hire for talent versus ego. And I like to say that everybody at Zynga rolls up their sleeves and works. And you can certainly hire the person who has the most flashy resume ever and the biggest ego in the world, and they likely will get you nowhere. And so I would rather hire someone who is humble and willing to do the work, but maybe has a less flashy title, than someone who particularly has been, saying, oh, I'm the chief of this, or I ran this, or I was the VP of that. And you can really get to that in an interview by asking them a lot of questions and seeing how many times in their answers they use the word I. So the other thing that I like to talk about for employees, and this has come up a lot in the press around work-life balance, and I thought it would be interesting for you. So Tony Hsieh, who sort of has this famous culture at Zappos of being super employee and customer friendly, he talks a lot about this happiness framework, which is sort of how people their happiness related to how they spend their time. And when people ask me about work-life balance, the biggest thing that I talk about, and it's directly related to customers at the same exact time, so employees or customer, it's this perceived control of your time. So if you set up a workforce that requires people to always have to be on, who feel like they can never make plans and keep plans, who feel like they can't necessarily decide what they're going to do with their life, sort of when they're going to come into work, when they're going to leave work, that is going to really hurt you. And work-life balance is really all about that. Do people have control of their time? Do they believe that they're going to be able to decide for themselves how their work gets done, when their work gets done, and how much happiness they're going to have from that work? And you can even watch it. So it's the same thing in games, right? So the sense of perceived progress in a game is also the same thing that you'll see in sort of perceived progress in your career. The connectedness that you feel with the people around you, and whether or not you feel connected to the experience. And then sort of, do you have this sense of vision and meaning? It's been really impactful to compare sort of those two things in terms of a player experience as well as an employee experience. And for those of you, if you haven't read Tony's book, I would really encourage you to do so. So my last couple tricks are making sure that you're finding people who are able to take risks and who are open to taking risks. We have a lot of conversations around how do we avoid the innovator's dilemma? How do we encourage innovation? How do we push the envelope forward? We want to talk about how you replace yourself. So within our workforce, we're always talking about this idea of if you want to take on job B from job A, you got to have someone in the seat who can take job A. It's super important to us. And so the last couple of ideas, I say hire Tiggers and not Eeyores. I say to know what your business is and spend a lot of time looking at it. And the biggest piece of advice I can always give to people is if you're doing interviews, it's always like an iceberg. All of the things that you will likely spend your time on are above the water. You can see them. So technical skills and business skills, any of that type of thing is all above the water. And people spend 90% of an interviews focusing on that. All of the trouble that you will ever have with your company or your workforce is below the water. It's the stuff that you can't see. I don't fire most people when I have to around the fact that they don't write great code. I write it because no one likes to work with them, because they don't like to come to work, that they're unhappy at work and they make everyone else miserable, or they have no passion or desire to be there. That's sort of the issue at the end of the day. My job is about an employee net promoter score. We spend a lot of time saying, would you refer your friends to come and work at Zynga? It's the most important thing that my people team is looking at and constantly working on. I would encourage you, if you are looking at your people and your employees, ask the question, would you refer your friends to come and work here? So thanks so much for your time today. Hope you learned a few things and enjoy playing.